Somewhere, right now, someone is turning down an opportunity that would genuinely improve their life. A better job, a healthier relationship, a real chance at something different, and calling it caution. Somewhere else, someone is staying inside a situation they openly admit makes them unhappy, simply because they already know exactly how it hurts. And the alternative is an unhappiness they haven't met yet. Neither of them thinks of themselves as afraid of change. Both of them are. There's a common belief that change only happens when things get bad enough, that people need to hit some dramatic bottom before real change becomes possible, and that until then, staying put is simply the reasonable choice. This belief conveniently excuses indefinite waiting. Picture someone who has known for years that a specific change would genuinely improve their life, and who keeps waiting for some future moment when it will feel more obviously necessary or more clearly justified. That moment, in most cases, never arrives on its own. Change doesn't require permission from a crisis. It requires a decision, one that's just as available on an ordinary Tuesday as it would be after some dramatic breaking point, if a person is willing to make it without waiting for circumstances to force their hand. Here's a specific, counterintuitive pattern worth understanding directly. Given a choice between a known difficulty and an unknown improvement, people very often choose the known difficulty, not because it's actually less painful, but because it's predictable. Picture someone in a job they find draining and unfulfilling, who nonetheless resists pursuing a genuinely promising alternative. The current job is bad in ways they've already mapped completely. They know exactly what to expect from it, day to day. The alternative, however promising, comes with genuine uncertainty. And for a lot of people, a known, mapped-out difficulty feels psychologically safer than an unmapped possibility, even when the unmapped possibility is very likely better. This isn't irrational in the way it sounds. It's a specific, deeply wired preference for predictability over improvement, one worth recognizing directly, because recognizing it is often the first step toward overriding it. Beyond simple unpredictability, there's a deeper reason change gets resisted. A significant change often requires becoming someone different than who a person has understood themselves to be. And that shift can feel, at a basic level, like a kind of loss before it becomes a gain. Picture someone who has spent years thinking of themselves as not a disciplined person, not good with money, or not someone who confronts conflict. Even when a genuine opportunity to change any of these things appears, some part of that person resists, not because the change wouldn't help, but because it would require letting go of a familiar, if unflattering story about who they are. This resistance rarely announces itself directly. It shows up as procrastination, as sudden doubt about whether the change is really worth it, as an inexplicable pull back toward old patterns right when new ones start to take hold. There's a specific comfort available in a problem that's been lived with long enough to become familiar, a strange, backwards kind of comfort, but a real one nonetheless. Picture someone who has struggled with the same specific issue for years, a habit, a relationship pattern, a recurring difficulty. Over time, this problem becomes part of the furniture of their identity. Friends know them partly through this struggle. Their own internal narrative has been built, in part, around managing or explaining it. Solving the problem completely, while obviously desirable in theory, quietly threatens this familiar structure. Who are they without the struggle that's partly defined them for years? This question, rarely asked directly, often sits underneath more resistance to genuine improvement than people realize. This explains a pattern that otherwise looks completely irrational. People making real progress toward a change they genuinely want, and then, seemingly without reason, undermining that exact progress right as it starts to take hold. Picture someone finally succeeding at a difficult change, genuinely improving a habit, a relationship, a financial situation, who then does something specific and self-defeating right at the point of real momentum, missing commitments that had been reliably kept, picking an unnecessary conflict, quietly reverting to an old pattern that had seemed resolved. This isn't a lack of willpower in the moment. It's often the identity protection mechanism discussed in the previous chapter, activating in response to a change that's starting to feel real enough to actually require a new self-concept, something that, however desired consciously, still feels destabilizing at a deeper level. Change doesn't happen in isolation, and it's worth naming directly that the people surrounding someone who is changing often have their own reasons, usually unconscious, to prefer they stay the same. Picture someone who decides to stop drinking and finds that certain friendships built partly around shared drinking suddenly feel strained, without either side fully understanding why. Or someone who becomes more assertive after years of being accommodating and finds that people who benefited from their previous accommodation respond with subtle resistance framed as concern. This isn't necessarily malicious. People build relationships around a specific known version of someone, and any real shift in that version can unsettle the whole system, even among people who genuinely care. Anticipating this resistance, rather than being blindsided by it, makes it considerably easier to withstand. Popular narratives about change tend to center on a single, dramatic turning point, a decisive moment after which everything is different. This makes for a compelling story and a genuinely misleading model of how real, lasting change actually happens. Picture someone who has, at various points, experienced exactly this kind of dramatic moment. A powerful realization, an emotional low that felt like it changed everything. And picture the same person months later, mostly back to their old patterns, disappointed that the dramatic moment didn't produce the permanent shift it seemed to promise at the time. Turning points can genuinely open a door. They rarely, on their own, walk a person all the way through it. What happens in the unglamorous months afterward tends to determine far more than the turning point itself ever could. If dramatic turning points don't reliably produce lasting change, what does? The same unglamorous mechanism responsible for nearly everything else discussed throughout this series. Small, repeated action, sustained long after the initial excitement of deciding to change has faded. Picture someone who, instead of waiting for a decisive moment of transformation, simply repeats a small, specific new behavior daily, long enough for it to stop requiring conscious effort. This is far less exciting than a dramatic turning point, and it's also considerably more reliable, because it doesn't depend on recreating an emotional peak, only on continuing an unremarkable action that doesn't require any particular feeling to sustain it. There's a specific, rarely discussed part of genuine change worth naming directly. Even a change towards something clearly better often involves a real, felt sense of loss for the old version of oneself. And this loss deserves acknowledgement rather than being treated as evidence that change is somehow wrong. Picture someone who has genuinely outgrown an old identity, a former way of coping, a former social circle, a former self-concept, and who nonetheless feels an unexpected pang of grief for that old version, even while being genuinely glad to have moved past it. This isn't contradiction. Change, even positive change, involves a real ending alongside the real beginning, and skipping past the ending without acknowledging it tends to make the whole process feel more unsettled than it needs to. Stripped of all its various disguises, caution, practicality, just not the right time, resistance to beneficial change is underneath usually a specific fear. Fear of an unfamiliar version of life, even one that's likely better, simply because it hasn't been tested and confirmed yet. Picture this fear named directly and honestly. Not fear of failure exactly, and not entirely fear of the unknown in the abstract, but a more specific fear that a new version of life, once actually inhabited, might turn out to require more of a person than the familiar one ever did, different responsibilities, different expectations, a self that has to actually show up differently going forward. Naming this fear precisely, rather than letting it operate disguised as caution, tends to make it considerably easier to move through rather than be quietly ruled by. Given everything discussed about identity threat and resistance, there's a practical strategy worth naming directly. Changes introduced in small enough increments tend to bypass much of the resistance that a large, sudden change would immediately trigger. Picture someone attempting a significant lifestyle change all at once, versus someone introducing the same eventual change through a series of smaller steps, each one modest enough not to feel like a threat to their existing identity. The second approach is slower, and it's also often considerably more durable, precisely because it doesn't set off the same identity protective alarm that a dramatic, all-at-once change tends to trigger. A specific belief quietly derails a lot of genuine change attempts. The idea that any slip back into an old pattern means the entire effort has failed, and that starting over from zero is therefore the only honest option. Picture someone who has been building a genuinely new pattern for weeks, has one difficult day, and reverts briefly to the old behavior. If this gets interpreted as total failure, it often triggers exactly the kind of complete abandonment discussed elsewhere in this series, treating one bad day as proof the whole project was doomed, rather than as a completely normal, expected part of how change actually happens for almost everyone attempting it. Relapse, understood correctly, is data about a specific trigger or vulnerable moment worth addressing directly, not evidence that the entire direction of change was wrong. There's a specific, useful practice worth naming directly: acting consistently with a new identity before it fully feels true, rather than waiting for the feeling of being a changed person to arrive first. In the same sequencing trap discussed in an earlier episode of this series about motivation, picture someone in the early, uncertain stages of a genuine change, deliberately asking themselves, in specific moments, what would the person I'm becoming actually do right now? And acting on that answer, even while the new identity still feels somewhat borrowed or unfamiliar. Repeated enough times, this borrowed identity gradually becomes the genuine one, not because the feeling of authenticity arrived first, but because the consistent action eventually produced it. Given everything discussed throughout this episode, a final pattern is worth naming directly. The changes that actually last tend to look remarkably unremarkable from the outside, especially compared to how dramatic the internal decision to make them often felt at the time. Picture the difference between someone announcing a dramatic, sweeping transformation publicly versus someone quietly adjusting one specific behavior at a time, rarely mentioning it to anyone, simply living differently rather than performing the difference. The second version, less visible and less immediately impressive, tends to actually stick, precisely because it was never dependent on an audience's continued attention or approval to sustain it. Like everything else explored throughout this series, real change is never accomplished in a single decisive moment, however dramatic it might feel while it's happening. It's built the same quiet way discipline, patience, and every other quality discussed in this series are built, through small, repeated choices that rarely feel significant on their own. The small step taken instead of waiting for a bigger, more obvious moment of readiness. The relapse treated as information rather than proof of failure. The old identity grieved honestly rather than dismissed. The new identity acted out consistently before it fully feels true, until eventually it simply is. None of it announces itself as transformation while it's happening. But it accumulates, quietly, unremarkably, into a life genuinely different from the one a person started in, built not from a single turning point, but from the willingness to keep choosing the unfamiliar over the familiar, one small, boring day at a time. That is the comfort of a problem you already know. Not because staying was ever actually safer, but because you finally became someone willing to risk the unfamiliar version of better. If this reached you today, share it with someone who needs the reminder.